In this morning session, we're focusing on the historical context before and after Blessed Paul VI encyclical letter, Humanae Vitae. In many ways, the 20th century provided a kind of perfect storm for the church, especially in adhering to, as we heard from Archbishop Chaput last night, the perennial Christian teaching, opposing contraception. The Industrial Revolution of the previous centuries had already begun to transform the way people thought about children from an unqualified blessing to increasingly an economic burden, because family was no longer a center of economic productivity. Work had been moved outside of the home. The revision of this teaching by other Christian bodies, as the Archbishop touched on last night. Social changes, the new roles of women in post-war society, the rising costs of educating children in that society, sometimes hysterical fears over growing population and limited resources, all of which culminated in the mid to late 20th century with the advent of oral contraception, which provided the jet fuel to the sexual revolution which had been ignited in the 19th century. So when Blessed Paul VI reiterated the perennial Christian teaching on this subject, his reiteration of that doctrine was met with an unprecedented opposition within the church. Really, again, a kind of perfect storm for the church and its ministry of teaching. So the papers we have this morning are going to explore some of the ongoing impact of that storm as it broke upon the church and as it broke upon the wider culture around us. Our first paper this morning, our first presentation, is by Dr. Donald Critchlow, who is a professor of history at Arizona State University and the director of the ASU Center for Political Thought and Leadership. Dr. Critchlow received his doctoral degree in history from the University of California, Berkeley, and has previously taught at St. Louis University and the University of Notre Dame. He published a number of books focusing on American political history, including his most recent book, Republican Character from Nixon to Reagan. Other titles include American Political History, a very short introduction, When Hollywood Was Right, How Movie Moguls, Film Stars, and Big Business Remade American Politics, and Intended Consequences, Birth Control, Abortion, and the Federal Government. Dr. Critchlow is general editor for the New Oxford Encyclopedia of American Political and Legal History and the founding editor of the Journal of Policy History, a quarterly published by Cambridge University Press. Please join me in welcoming Professor Donald Critchlow.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you here in Washington, D.C. It's a little colder here than it is in Phoenix, Arizona, where I'm from. It's a little earlier here, too. So I feel like the first person who raises their hand after a presentation, it's always hard to go first. So I hope I don't end up ruining this great conference we have, but we'll see. God works in mysterious ways sometimes, I think. In 1966, the rock group Buffalo Springfield sang, "Something's happening here, and it ain't exactly clear." I'll spare you singing it. The song was about Vietnam, but the lyrics could very well have described the culture of the United States in the 1960s. Something was happening here, and it was the beginnings of a transformative sexual revolution. The deep consequences of this revolution were not fully clear at the time, But over the next century, it became clear that fundamental changes had occurred in sexual mores, gender relations, and traditional family relations. The sexual revolution was never complete, and it came with resistance. But sexual politics entered into the mainstream of American political life. Issues such as reproductive rights, gay rights, same-sex marriage, divided the two major parties, Republican and Democratic, the electorate, families, and generations. By the first decades of the 21st century, however, the social consequences of this sexual revolution have become clear to most people, whatever their views on the social issues. In the midst of this sexual revolution, Pope Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae, released in July 25, 1968, stands as a profound and affirmative expression of traditional values concerning the divine gift of life, responsible parenthood and marriage, and the dignity of women in an age of rapid and great change. His affirmation of the family to the preservation of a healthy social order was deeply rooted in classical philosophy and traditional understandings of the church's teachings and practice. But of equal importance, although given less attention by the media and many commentators at the time, were the encyclical's warnings about the dangers of a morally unrestrained state power in regulating human life and death, and the consequences of the breakdown of the traditional family and the moral order for civilization itself. In effect, the encyclical presented a Jeremiah against the consequences of human arrogance. Humanae Vitae proved controversial in its drafting and later release. The Church's opposition to artificial contraception, sterilization, and abortion had important political and policy consequences for the Roman Catholic Church in the United States, and especially for the National Conference of Catholic Bishops and Catholic welfare organizations. Americans serving on the drafting commission and its subcommittees were major proponents for changing the church's opposition for artificial contraception. Dissent within the church in America, in the United States, continued to rumble after the encyclical's release in 1968. As you pointed out, this was a perfect storm. Furthermore, Catholic church leaders and those involved in social welfare and medical institutions confronted delicate issues in accepting public monies while resisting government family planning policies. And I want to spend some time later in my talk exploring the difficulty federal policies had for Catholic organizations and the dissension it created within the bishops. 50 years later, these issues of church-state relations were not easily resolved and have not been easily resolved. Indeed, they may be even more complex given the advances of reproductive technology, the growth of government, and court interpretations of civil rights for gays. Any full assessment of Humanae Vitae needs to be placed within the political and policy context of the post-Second World War period. So we'll turn to this first. Witnessing the horrors of the Second Global War in a century, that is, the Second World War, many American leaders in business, philanthropic foundations, and academia concluded that future wars could be prevented by population control. This neo-Malthusian worldview took deep root in America and among global leaders. This obsession with global and national population control as a panacea for addressing the problems of a world cannot be overemphasized. Population control manifested itself in policy initiatives internationally and domestically, as well as funding efforts to develop new and better contraceptive methods. This belief in the necessity of population control manifested itself in developing birth control programs and centers funded by initially philanthropic foundations in Asia, Western Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, as well as supporting scientific and technological research for better artificial contraceptives, including oral contraception. The development of domestic and international supported family planning occurred in 3 stages in the post-war period. The first stage, occurring in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, was initiated by philanthropic foundations led by the Population Council to support establishment of family planning clinics and programs in countries outside the United States. In the second stage, as these programs were established, lobbyists working for philanthropic institutions were undertaken to commit the federal government to family planning within the United States. These lobbying efforts proved successful in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program to eliminate poverty. Family planning was seen as an instrument to reduce poverty. Specifically, inner city neighborhoods, Black minorities, and Native Americans on reservations were targeted in these programs. And then Richard Nixon's administration extended family planning efforts and funding for these programs. In the second stage occurred within the context of growing fears of a population explosion that was predicated on a view that we were going to see world famine, wars, and social conflict. These fears were articulated by books such as Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb, published in 1968, numerous magazine articles, science fiction novels, and movies, and they all produced this dystopian future for humankind unless the rate of population growth was controlled. The third stage came in response and reaction against federally supported family planning, specifically federally funded sterilization and abortion. This domestic reaction coincided with revelations of widespread abuses by the United Nations and U.S. funding population control programs abroad, especially in Southeast Asia and India. And what occurred in India was absolutely abhorrent. Strangely, it was the feminists who were especially outraged by the draconian measures that were undertaken in population control programs in India, which included forced sterilization of thousands of rural villagers. Family planning organizations, in its multiple manifestations, brought together in both the first stage and the second stage advocates for eugenics, euthanasia, abortion rights, population control, immigration, and environmentalism. Often these organizations involved in voluntary sterilization, eugenics, population control, abortion rights, and so forth, had interlocking directorships. But what they shared in common was a faith in massive social engineering while espousing individual rights. Freedom entailed social control over the living and the dying. Control was to be exerted by the enlightened in the name of humanity. In the post-war period, philanthropists, military leaders, wealthy industrialists, and scientific experts joined together to undertake one of the most massive efforts of social engineering seen in history, the control of global population growth. Think of that. Think of what the arrogance this entailed. You were going to control world population growth. And giving voice to this, to the need for population control, was John D. Rockefeller III, who established the Population Council in 1952. The first draft of the Council's charter spoke of the need to control overpopulation and creating conditions in which, and listen carefully, and I quote, in which parents who are often above average in intelligence, quality of personality, unquote, produce, and quote, larger than average families. They wanted to control population for everybody else except themselves. The eugenics language was dropped in the final version of the charter, although the belief that population control was for the masses and not for the elite remained an understood assumption for the Population Council. Other organizations entered the field of population control as well. The Ford Foundation poured millions of dollars into population control programs. In the early 1960s, the United Nations, at the prompting of American and world leaders, got involved in worldwide efforts to reduce population growth. Others joining the cause were Planned Parenthood of America, the Population Crisis Committee funded by Hugh Moore, who had founded the Dixie Cup. Moore was vociferous in his commitment to population control and played a key role in establishing International Planned Parenthood. He and others in the International Planned Parenthood were critical in organizing the first international conference on voluntary sterilization in 1964. So you can see how these efforts were coming together. The philanthropic foundations and individuals within the movement were also funded scientific projects to produce better artificial contraception. The Population Council and many other foundations helped develop oral contraception, the pill, which hit the market in about 1960. And later, Population Council funding was provided to develop the morning after pill. The Johnson administration moved into federally supported family planning in a big way. The Public Health Service began directing funds for family planning pilot projects in through community health programs. The Interior Secretary, Stuart Udall, instructed the Public Health Service to make family planning services available for Native Americans on Indian reservations. Meanwhile, the Department of Health issued policy directive allowing family planning services for military personnel on Army bases. The United States Agency for International Development, USAID, launched family planning projects on a global basis. Head of the agency, by the way, Heimer Hovenholt, a population control fanatic, had his business cards printed on condoms. He was so fanatic in his efforts. somewhat laughable in some ways, but the federal government's involvement in domestic and international family planning in this period drew bipartisan support in Congress. In 1965, 8 family planning bills were introduced by Congress. Next year, in 1966, more than 30 states provided family planning services. The Office of Economic Opportunity under the Johnson administration launched 45 family planning projects located, of course, in public housing, churches, and community centers. The Children's Bureau established a program to provide grants to states for family planning, while the Office of Education funded close to 700 projects to develop family planning. And then, under Richard Nixon's administration, these programs were further enlarged through the Family Planning Services and Population Research Act in 1960. But that wasn't enough. There were calls for more coercive measures to curb population growth. In 1967, Kingsley Davis, a leading demographer at the University of California, Berkeley, where I got my degree, not then though, a bit later, published an article in Science called Population Policy, Will Current Progress Succeed? Warning that voluntary family planning might not be enough. He suggested that zero population growth might necessitate indirect measures such as tax credits for having fewer children. But if this failed, zero population advocates might explore possibilities to undertake more coercive measures. Just a year after the release of Humanae Vitae, Richard Bauer, a founding member of Zero Population Growth, a breakaway organization from the Sierra Club, declared voluntarism is dead. It's a farce. He urged elected officials to consider licenses for couples to have children, sterilization of welfare recipients, and new laws enforcing population limits, including forced sterilization for parents with more than 5 children. He gained the support of Cordelia Scaife May, heir to the Mellon banking fortune. Bauer and zero population might have represented the extreme, but the extreme was becoming mainstream in this kind of hysteria. As the federal government entered into federal family planning, it created a dilemma for bishops. Catholic social services and hospitals counted on federal funds, but now the federal government was insisting that these agencies and hospitals provide family planning, counseling, and services. And so divisions erupted within the bishops' conference itself. And these divisions became apparent in the testimony offered in Congress by William H. Ball, General Counsel of the Pennsylvania Catholic Welfare Committee. Appearing in Congress in August 1965, Ball took a strong stance against federally supported family planning. But Ball's testimony didn't go over well within everyone on the Bishops' Council. Monsignor Tanner said that the Ball's view did not represent the views of the conference because, as he put it, we as Catholics have no rights to impose our views on these people. This is quite a new issue that we will have to resolve carefully. In late 1965, the Office of Economic Opportunity head, Sergeant Shriver, as we know, was President Kennedy's brother-in-law and a practicing Catholic, told the bishops that he was now under pressure from Planned Parenthood for OEO to finance abortion and sterilization, which he opposed. In response, the bishops began working on a public statement as to the guidelines for OEO. But many in the conference didn't want to go too far out on the issue. At an informal meeting to discuss the conference's position, Monsignor Francis Hurley raised rhetorical questions. He asked, isn't this situation similar to what we faced 30 or 40 years ago about education and taking federal funds for education? He asked, is there something intrinsically dangerous in government's involvement in family planning? Are we in a position to say that Planned Parenthood shouldn't have a right to be involved in anti-poverty programs? But the bishops felt compelled to issue a public statement on federal family planning. But here was the hitch, a hitch indeed. They couldn't agree on what to say. And after much prolonged discussion, with many, many memos, it was finally decided that there were too much division over birth control itself and family planning, and so the majority on the bishops decided it was best not to issue any statement at all. They waited for answers from Rome, where a select commission on birth control had been meeting since 1963. Pope John XXIII convened a small commission of theologians, social scientists, and physicians in October to prepare a Vatican statement on the population question. The commission agreed at its first meeting that it should move beyond demographic questions and address the Church's message on marriage and artificial birth control. A expanded commission was formed in March 1964 to include 34 theologians, laypersons, 9 members of the clergy, 12 members of religious orders, and several American delegates. The commission opened a year later in Rome in March 1965 with a lecture by legal scholar John T. Newton providing a history of the Church's position on contraception. Newton spoke for 2 hours, concluding, quote, "The matter is open enough to deserve the attentive study of church in light of new scientific, social, and historical understanding," unquote. The message was clear. The church's position on contraception had changed over time and should be reconsidered in the light of recent history. With this opening lecture, the commission debated artificial contraception for the next 2 years. Conservatives on the commission argued for keeping the church's traditional opposition, but it became clear that the majority had different sentiment. In the end, the majority report recommended that the pill be accepted, and the church's position on artificial contraception, the pill be changed. When this majority report was leaked to the press in 1967, it was picked up by the National Catholic Reporter. It made headlines on both sides of the Atlantic. And then when Pope John VI issued Humanae Vitae that summer, he explicitly rejected the majority report. He had been persuaded by conservatives on the commission and the Vatican to condemn the pill and to reaffirm and affirm traditional teachings on the sanctity of human life. But the reaction to the encyclical was severe. In the midst of this controversy, and I mention this because I'm here at CUA, bring up bad memories for you. give you a sense that maybe the future will be better than the past. The Board of Trustees at Catholic University of America denied Charles Curran, a leading advocate for artificial contraception, tenure in the theology department, overturning the faculty's unanimous recommendation for tenure. In support of Curran, 2,000 students, joined by much of the faculty, went out on strike in protest of the decision. And under pressure, the board knuckled under and granted Curran tenure. And then adding fuel to the fire, Hugh Moore, remember him from Dixie Cup, organized a petition signed by 2,600 scientists criticizing the encyclical. The petition was published in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Commonweal, and then it was translated into Spanish and French and sent to every American bishop. But the opposition to the encyclical came from within the church itself. Los Angeles Association of Laymen publicly declared their opposition to the encyclical. John Noonan and others on the commission held a well-received press conference denouncing the decision. And then furthermore, 26 professors of theology, I have to get back to this, I apologize, I'm being rude, at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and 26 parish priests in the Archdiocese of Washington were suspended by Cardinal Boyle. Within months, many of the suspended priests left the priesthood. I'm not sure about the professors, however. Once you have tenure, it's hard to get rid of them, I know. The tenure of multiple articles in the American Foreign Press depicted the Catholic Church in the United States in disarray. Priests confronting it depicted priests confronting an intransigent, out-of-touch hierarchy, and lay Catholics deserting church in droves. The tone of these articles is captured in their headlines. I'll just give you a few. There are dozens and dozens. Quote, theologians gain support and dissent on birth control, Vatican's credibility gap, rebellion from within, rebel priests picked off and silenced one by one, young rebels want the Pope to resign. Press reports depicted American Dissent as a much larger movement that was part of a larger movement that was also occurring in Britain and Western Europe. The British press was also full of these articles of dissenting priests. One doesn't need to read David Lodge to see this. Many a little show I sometimes go beyond the archives, but not much. Many American lay Catholics appeared to concur to the opposition to the encyclical. Parish numbers appeared to fall as many left the church. Critics of Humanae Vitae blame the encyclical for declining church attendance, but I do think it should be noted the church attendance numbers for liberal Protestant and mainline churches were also in decline. Controversy over abortion, however, was far from over. In the late 1960s, feminists began to raise concerns about the health effects of the pill. In 1969, Barbara Seaman published a doctor's case against the pill as reports of strokes, breast cancer, and other negative effects on women taking the pill began to circulate. Liberal Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson held public hearings on the pill's side effects. What critics claimed accurately is that the pill had not been properly tested before being put on the market. The only major tests that had been run were in Puerto Rico by a group of poor women who were induced to to take the pill. And in the consequence of this controversy, the pharmaceutical industry came under bad light. And what did they do? Well, they launched a major advertising campaign promoting the pill as the pill of liberation. Finally, it should be said that Cyril and the major pharmaceuticals had to back down. Let me just say this, that in the 1960s, many American politicians just simply didn't understand the abortion issue. I think this was the case of Ronald Reagan when he signed a very liberal abortion bill in California. He later changed his views. It was also seen in New York under Nelson Rockefeller, a governor who had even a more expanded abortion bill. Just a quick story, show how new this issue was. Rockefeller read in a newspaper an op-ed in which Thomas Aquinas was quoted. He immediately he saw this, immediately phoned up an aide and said, "Get hold of this Aquinas guy." I need to meet with him. He only discovered they had been dead a couple thousand years. But the other part I want to tell you is something I think much more interesting. And this is based on extensive archival research, which I took when I think I was the first person to look at the Rockefeller papers in Population Council. The shift really began to occur, I think, in public sentiment on contraception and life issues really around abortion. And that marked a major shift in public opinion. In the midst of this shift, the shift was indicated by Richard Nixon's rejection of a commission he set up on population and American future, which was chaired by John D. Rockefeller III. He rejected the commission's finding on abortion on request, which was abortion on demand, and immigration restriction. Rockefeller thought Nixon was just playing politics to win the Catholic vote as the election in 72 approached. He was right about that in large part, but he also saw the problem is the kind of intransigent public that didn't understand the abortion issue. And so he decided, and population control experts, as well as other foundations, to undertake a campaign to liberalize American sexual mores. And because if American sexual mores were liberalized, the Americans, they believed, would be more susceptible to abortion. And it was a well-orchestrated campaign. And I want to say outright that directly that this wasn't a conspiracy, but it was a well-orchestrated campaign. The sexual revolution was already occurring. They didn't start it. But meeting with magazine editors, journalists, TV producers, and other people of influence, as well as foundation officers and others, they began to pour money into a campaign for editorials, for publications. Money was directed to psychics, to gay organizations, for Catholics for Choice, as well as other organizations. Psychics was giving money to develop a New York public school program so that children could explore their own sexual, and this is in the early 70s, to explore their own sexual identity, have self-exploration, and feel comfortable in exploring one another's, other kids' genitalia. Rockefeller funded the first public documentary that would be aired on New York public TV. which was about 8 homosexual couples, showing that they were that they were just like you and I. They poured money into NARAL, they poured money into ACLU's reproductive rights, and the Guttmacher Institution. They were encouraging a sexual revolution that was already occurring in America. It was designed to liberalize American values around sexual mores. This was already occurring, but it was now being accelerated. But in the end, and I conclude, is that what Humanae Vitae proved was to be absolutely prophetic in its warnings about the breakdown of the traditional family and the depersonalization of sexual relations that we now see in America. The fundamental, I study public policy, I'm not a theologian, I feel a bit out of my depth here, I have to say, but what is evident is that the breakdown of the family and the discord that's being caused by children growing up in single-parent homes is having widespread manifestations of serious consequences of incarceration rates, drug and alcohol abuse, and so forth. What's interesting is that while out-of-wedlock births have begun to decline for many minority groups and for younger women, and we should be glad for this, what we are seeing is a rapid increase, about 70%, for women between the ages of 25 to 34. It's an interesting, very interesting phenomena, I think. At the same time, one other point should be made. What's also evident in the social science literature is the importance of organized religion in addressing these kinds of problems. High school and lesser educated women with children, single parents who attend church regularly, their kids do better in school. They have higher graduation rates, they take tougher courses, and when they go to college, they're more successful. And I might add that even in higher education attainment families, higher socioeconomic groups, we see the same kind of thing. Parents from the upper classes who go to church and their children attend, their children do better than even their peer groups. Organized religion is important. What the proponents of family planning tried to do is what often happens with kind of a liberal mentality, is to find some instrument, they see a problem and they're going to get a technological fix. We need a cultural fix in this country. And I think that's where we're headed. So today we could begin our discussion on Humanae Vitae, and let's proceed and let's have a full-throated discussion about what we confront in this country as Christians and citizens of our great country. Thank you very much. Thank you.